Well, good morning. So I was asked to give two talks. Today, I want to talk about spending. And next Sunday morning, talk about revenues. And so I want to start this off, hoping this moves on. There we go, with this from Matthew 6:21. As a base to begin thinking about what matters. Now and then I've had discussions with young people who are planning to get married, and I tell them the most important thing in your life after you're married, after your life is your marriage, and you should every day invest in it, build it, strengthen it. If you're a guy, you should remember that we live in a society that is sending constant messages to women that something is wrong with you. And you need to express that, no, nothing is wrong with you. You're terrific, just the way you are. So first I want to start with some basic data. The gross domestic product in 2023, last year, was almost $28 trillion. I mean, just an unimaginable number. And government spending at all levels. And this backs out, by the way, transfers where the federal government gives money to the states and the cities. This is actual government spending netted out is 10 trillion, which is 36% of the economy. That's a huge number. However, that number is low among modern countries, countries that are part of the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, sometimes by critics called the Rich Countries Club. A number of societies spend over 40%. There have been countries that spend over 50%. The Danes, when they were at 51%, year after year after year, were determined in surveys to be the happiest people in the world. The Norwegians at a little below and the Swedes at a little below were all quite happy. In fact, among those Nordic countries, the only issue really was that the Swedes weren't having the economic growth of the Norwegians because they didn't have all that oil. And that had some impact on wages and future outlooks. Now, this chart shows you, and it's one of several I want to spend a moment with, the amount of money the federal government is spending. The amount of money the federal government is spending relative to gross domestic product, which is our best measure of economic output. It's not a perfect measure, and I'll give you my favorite absurd example of that. If you want to grow domestic product, when someone steals a bicycle, it's the costs of addressing that bicycle theft are counted exactly the same as if somebody commits a mass murder. So if you want more gross domestic product, encourage more crime and spend more money on police, and GDP will grow, because we don't count negative impacts on growth. We just count spending. Now, this is the percent change in government expenditures. And what I want you to notice here is how it went up here under Donald Trump during the pandemic and then fell sharply. But also notice, if we go back here to 1980, the general trend has been way down here in terms of growth. This is the last year of the Truman administration. At the very beginning, actually, that's the last year of the Truman administration. Government spending has an enormous impact on your welfare, even if you don't see it directly. Now, this is the estimated percent of people who are living in poverty in our country. And I want you to notice this is 95. Bill Clinton is president. At the end of his presidency, we're way down to a little over 11%. Because of the policies that he had in place. Then it starts to rise under the next administration, whose policies were quite openly in favor of rich people. George W. Bush didn't deny that at the time. He tried to dress it up in more palatable language, but there was no question what he was going to do if you paid attention and knew anything about economics. And we get to this peak up here, and then it begins to come down sharply. Goes up under Trump because of the, and then look, it's falling back down again. This is 2023. We have an enormously high level of poverty compared to other rich countries. How many of you have not ever been to Europe or Japan? Okay, one person. How many homeless people were you approached by on the streets in Berlin or Amsterdam? They don't have them because of their government policies. They don't have the kind of poverty that we do. And they absolutely don't have the kind of child poverty we do. There are over 2,000 children in the Rochester City schools who are regarded by the school district as homeless. Now, that doesn't mean they're sleeping on the streets. They couch surf, they stay with friends, but they're homeless. And as someone who goes and speaks whenever I am invited, and I'd like to have more invitations in Rochester high schools, one of the things I'm always struck by is the kids who are sleeping in class because they really haven't had any decent sleep. They're not going to go anywhere in life as things stand. And then finally, I think this is the last chart. This is the federal net outlays as a share of GDP. And you'll see they explode under Trump during the pandemic and fall right back down. And we have this peak here in 2010 because we had the big recession, the Great Recession of 2008, which was offset. But as soon as that offset took effect, Barack Obama became very much an austerity president. He brought the federal budget deficit, that is the annual shortfall, not the total debt, down by 2/3 by the end of his presidency. Now, the way the government presents data to us is deceptive. My career started when I was 17 years old. I was a senior in high school. I was hired by a shopper newspaper, if you remember those. And I was writing a column about the school, and they sent me to the school board for minimum wage, and I think it was 20 cents an inch for any copy that they ran. And the school district in Santa Cruz, California, handed out a press release, and you'll know this is 1966 when I tell you what it said. Next year, property taxes on the average Santa Cruz home worth $34,211 will go up by $43.02. Well, that was dutifully reported exactly that way the next day by our local daily newspaper, the Santa Cruz Sentinel. I looked at that, knowing nothing about what I was doing. I'm a high school kid. And I went, that's useless information. I turned the press release over. I divided, and I'm trying to remember the exact number. I think it was, I'll give you what comes up in my head. My story said your Santa Cruz Unified School District property taxes next year will go up by $1.35 for every $1,000 this county says your house is worth. This got letters to the editor. Shoppers don't get letters to the editor from people saying, how useful. It got the Sentinel reporter, after I did a couple more stories like this, to come to me and say, I don't know what you're doing, but you've got to stop it. And of course, I got the exact opposite message. And at 19 years old, less than 2 years later, I was a staff writer on the front page of the San Jose Mercury, now the 6th biggest newspaper in America. So here's how the government presents the data. Both the White House and the Congressional Budget Office, because they use the same data, they say our military spending is 13% of the federal budget. Here's how the War Resisters League, unquestionably a biased group, presents it. What do they do here? Well, first they examine past military spending, and they simply take the annual budget deficits and the share that year of military spending and add that share of past budget deficits to the military proportionally. Then we have current military spending. Now, why do they have 21% instead of 13%? Well, among other things, they count the national intelligence agencies, what's called Federal Budget Category 50. We spend well over $100 billion a year on 17 intelligence agencies, the ones who write the CIA prepares every day the most expensive, smallest audience newscast in the world, the Presidential Daily Brief. which Donald Trump often didn't take, and he didn't understand it one bit. After all, this is a man who didn't understand why there's a memorial over the USS Arizona. It had to be explained to him. Now, in addition, you'll see we spend 5% on physical resources. That's things like roads, dams, other permanent or lasting, at least enduring investments. And then we spend 43% on human resources, which is defined by these folks as Social Security, Medicare, education, things like that. And then this is sort of a miscellaneous category over here. But when you look at it this way, military spending is 45% of our budget. Now, we're an empire. Anybody thinks we're not an empire, I wish you could come back 1,000 years from now, because I assure you that's what they're going to teach junior high school kids, the American empire. Nothing per se wrong with being an empire. And in many ways, our being an empire has been a good thing in the world. There have been a lot of bad things I could give you a whole long talk about, but there have been a lot of good things. But the reality is we are an empire and we have to behave like one. But here's something we don't necessarily have to do. We have, through our federal spending programs, not just some upward redistribution of income, which I've written a great deal about, but age redistribution. We spend $7 per senior citizen for every dollar we spend on children per capita. This is per affected individual. Now, in some ways that makes sense. First of all, older people have most of the health bills in this country. About 25% of all health bills occur in the last 30 days of life. Secondly, children are actually pretty cheap. Very few of them have medical expenses. In fact, if you, I spent a year at the Los Angeles Times studying medical economics and writing about it for the paper. And one of the things I learned is that there actually are people who live a whole long life. One of the editors there, unbeknownst to me, was one of these people. I didn't know at the time. He lived to be 89 years old, and he literally was never sick a day in his life. He would say to people, if they were sick, he'd say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I wish I could feel sympathy for you, but I've never been sick." And then he got sick, and he was supposed to die in 3 weeks, and he hung on for 9 months. On the other hand, there are children born who are $1 million a year medical cases every day. Well, if you chop off these outliers, over our lifespans, we'll all spend roughly the same amount of money on healthcare. There's not a lot of variation once you take off the top, about half of 1% at each end. Now, all young people hopefully will become old people. So this is not per se a bad measure, but it should remind us that we are oriented toward federal spending for older people. Now, investing in kids, on the other hand, can pay unbelievably huge dividends. If you can find an investment that pays 13% per annum, compounded, that means your money will double in roughly every 6 years. Go put every penny you've got into it. Go put every dollar you've got. That's an unbelievable rate of return. And this comes from James Heckman, who is a professor of economics at the University of Chicago, where I was on a graduate fellowship studying economics at the doctoral level. I have no college degree of any kind, but at the doctoral level, 51 years ago. From his most recent paper, if you're poor, you're probably going to stay poor. If you were born rich, you're going to grow rich. I can pretty accurately predict the likelihood of your economic outcome if I know your zip code. And this is the biggest single force in changing, in providing mobility. It was established more than a decade ago by Larry Bartels at Princeton and Jacob Hacker at Yale. And I've lectured to Hacker's classes at Yale when I was at the New York Times, that an increasing share of scholarships and other benefits to get people in college was going to the top quarter, children from the top quarter of households, the highest quarter of households. Now, if you're at the 75% mark, you're just middle class. In fact, if you're at the 90% mark, you're just middle class. But less and less over time was going to children in the bottom half. That was the important measure. And the result of this is we live in a society where people now acquire assets. More and more people acquire assets. If you had been your great-grandparents, they would have acquired, unless they owned a business, little to no assets. They might have a house they paid for. They might well have built that house themselves. Husband and wife, and maybe some help from neighbors, built that house. That's pretty much the only asset they would have. They might have some little life insurance or something like that. People did not have assets. It is not like today, where it's incredibly common to be a millionaire. 1 in 5 American households are millionaires. 1 in 5. On the other hand, we have lots of poverty. And back in the late 1800s, there was a reformer, Henry George, who wrote about the increase of wealth and want at the same time, that wealth and want were both growing. And in the 1890s, excluding the Bible, the best-selling book for 10 years was his book, Progress and Poverty, in which he showed that government policies were creating more poverty and more wealth simultaneously, which is exactly, I would contend, what we are doing today. Okay, so that's the end of the slide presentation. I just wanted to lay some sort of basic groundwork. Sorry, now that you've done all that work, David. Not sure how to turn that off. I'll put it over here. So, the way we spend our money personally says a lot about who we are. I had a conversation the other day with a very successful journalist who is about my age. I'm 75, and he's broke, and his wife left him, and his kids hate him. And what I didn't say to him was, well, yeah, because you spent most of your money, your time, and your interest on chasing young women, interns in the newsroom and the like. And guess what you get at the end of the day for that? Where you spend your money says a lot about where your heart is. And as a nation, the same thing applies, because we live in a democratic society. We created the United States of America in 1787. The second American Republic. Don't forget that. We live in the second American Republic. You know, the French say they live in the Fifth Republic. The Nazis called their regime the Third Reich. We live in the second American Republic. And we created it explicitly for 2 purposes. One was to tax ourselves, because the Articles of Confederation government had no power to tax. And related to that, to regulate commerce. And regulation is a form of tax. That's part 1. And if you doubt that, just go to the Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution, which are the powers clause of Congress. And the very first words are, the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, and imposts. That's the major purpose of our Constitution, is to tax us. Not that anybody is taught that in schools anywhere in America. The second was to eliminate a system that required unanimity among the 13 states, and instead set up this complex mechanism to enact laws and amend the Constitution that was designed to make it possible but difficult, so that the passions of the moment would not overwhelm the government. And we can see how successful that is as slowing progress. If you think about the fact that from the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 to the 19th Amendment taking effect in 1920 was 72 years. Now, the fight for suffrage is much older than 1848. That's just a good demarcation point. But nonetheless, it took 72 years to persuade enough men, because they were the only people with the power to do this, to allow women to vote. And they did it in a way that overwhelmingly favored white women, not Black, Latino, Asian, indigenous women, but white women, because of the way this played out once we got the constitutional amendment. Nonetheless, we made progress. We got child labor laws, despite ministers of the day who were saying quite literally, those who favor these laws against children working in the factories are the agents of the devil, for it is God's plan that these children work and be productive. And they were shameless about it. One of the reasons that slavery, not old world slavery, not the slavery of the ancient world where people would volunteer to become slaves sometimes, where many leading intellectuals and business people were slaves because the country they lived in had been conquered. And they then worked as intellectuals, as teachers, as philosophers, as business managers. One of the reasons that New World slavery, which said people who are slaves are not human beings, they have less rights than a dog, was ministers who supported and promoted this. They were absolutely crucial to this, was religious support for this. Now, nonetheless, what we think about, what we do, and how we spend our money goes right to the heart of what we care about. So there are things we could do that would be more caring, would produce a more productive society that would make everyone better off, not any one given individual necessarily, but all of us, if we simply chose to do those things, all of which are consistent with my reading of the Old Testament and the New. And fundamental to this is a concept and a word I'm trying to get reintroduced into American society: regard. We need to have regard for the other. We have regard for the welfare of people we don't know, people who aren't like us, people we will never meet, people who are not born yet. But we need to have regard for them if we're going to create a better society, and if we're going to have our hearts and our spending by our government of our money that we authorized our government to collect to benefit more of us. So the number one thing we could do in this country would be something Donald Trump told me in 1990 he was in full support of: universal health care with no out-of-pocket expenditures, all financed by the government, so that business owners don't have to spend time about it. They don't have to think about, well, I don't know, if I hire this gal instead of that gal, this one looks healthier and probably better for my long-term costs for time off and health and whatnot. You become indifferent to that. There is a Toyota assembly plant. And assembly plants, by the way, are not a big deal. Very little value added when you assemble a car. Think about when you were younger and parents, those Christmas evenings or other nights you spent putting things together that came in a box, tin metal doll houses. That's not the value added work. The value added work is the design, and in an automobile, the heat treated parts of the car, the internal combustion engine, if it has one, and the transmission. That's where the value is. So Hamilton, Ontario has a Toyota assembly plant, despite the fact that Alabama, one of the very poorest states in America, offered tax subsidies and outright grants that almost equaled the whole cost of building the plant. Why did Toyota choose to go to Canada, where it had to pay to build the plant with very little in subsidies? Well, there were two factors. One, Canadian healthcare is on the books of the society. It's not on the books of the companies. So it's not on your financial ledgers. It's in your tax bill, but it's not on your financial ledgers. Secondly, in Alabama, and any of you who bought a Mercedes built in Alabama may understand the truth of this, because they are notorious for having lots of problems. The way workers on the assembly line learn how to do their job is by the use of color-coded cards. Whereas in Hamilton, Ontario, they hand you a thick book with the rules and you're responsible for learning them. The reading comprehension skills are inadequate in much of the United States to do something as relatively low skill as assembling automobiles, not designing them, but assembling them. And the reason for that, 54% of American adults read at the level of a sixth grader or lower. 54%, more than half. So the median level of reading skill in the US is essentially the end of fifth grade. 22% of Americans, that's more than 1 in 5. 22% read at the level of a third grader, an 8-year-old. And those people are functionally illiterate. There's a reason Donald Trump says at every rally, we love the poorly educated. Two reasons for that. One, everybody else dumps on these people. You're stupid. And they aren't stupid in the sense that they don't understand anything about what's happening. We don't need to gratuitously insult them. And secondly, he makes them feel like they're special. And I'll tell you how powerfully that works. When my oldest son and I had a business, I just advised him, although technically I was the head of the business, running a hotel. We didn't own a hotel, we managed the hotel. We adopted best care policies. So when you were leaving with your kids from this hotel on the boardwalk in Ocean City, New Jersey, after your visit, my son would sit down and talk with the kids, and then he would let them go into a treasure chest and get little gifts. And he would find out things like, oh, my Aunt Carrie is supposed to have a baby in March. And we'd write all this down, and you'd show up to check in the next year, and the kid at the desk is a foreign student from Bulgaria or formerly East Germany, something like that. And they would go, oh, Mr. Schwartz, did your granddaughter get married like you were expecting? People, what? To work on the front desk, you had to pass a test. Somebody asked, well, we want to have an Italian dinner. Oh, well, here are the 5 Italian restaurants you can go to, and then tell you how to walk there if you want to work on the desk, because a lot better job than making beds, right? Regard for others can really pay off, and regard in healthcare would pay enormous benefits. And I'm going to give you a number about our spending on healthcare that should stay with you, I hope, the rest of your life, and you spread to other people. We spend 6.1 to 6.3% more of our gross domestic product on healthcare than France and Germany. France has, by every study I have ever seen, and I have literally read a dozen of them, the best healthcare system in the world. Everybody I know who lives in France, both American expatriates there and French people, all say fabulous healthcare. I've used it once. I had incredibly great experience. Does 6.1% of GDP mean a damn thing to any of you? I mean, I work with these every day and it doesn't mean anything to me. It's a big number. Well, I want to give it meaning, and that's what I want you to remember. If we had the French system, you get seen by a doctor faster than in the US. They have lots of technology. There's plenty of doctors to see you. There's no waits like we have often in the US. When I got skin cancer, it took 7 months from observing to surgery. 7 months to get approvals for me to have my surgery. The cost of that 6.1, oh, and I'm sorry, they have universal care. We have 90% care officially, but about 20 to 30% of the people who have care, they have FACOCTA plans. They're no good. They're not useful. They don't provide them with the care that they need. So we really only have about 60% of Americans that have high quality health care, mostly through health insurance or Medicare. 6.1% of GDP equals all the income taxes paid by everyone who made less than $600,000 in 2023. So all else being equal, that's one of the things economists love to say, all else being equal, which it never is. If we adopted the French healthcare system, the threshold for paying income taxes could be set for a married couple at $600,000. You wouldn't pay any income taxes until you made $600,000. By the way, more than 99% of federal income taxes are paid by people who make more than $600,000 a year, even with all of the people who don't pay any, which I'll get to next week about how that works. But think about that. We could free up trillions of dollars of spending in this country, have universal health care, which means that some people who are taxpayers but who get injured or sick, don't get proper medical care, and are converted by the system into tax eaters because they're on welfare, they're on workers' comp, they're on Medicaid, they're on early Social Security for disability. If they get proper care, they can go back to work. They would continue to be taxpayers, even if they're minimal taxpayers, rather than tax eaters, if we just adopted universal, no out-of-pocket health care. Oh, socialist medicine, terrible. I don't hear people complaining about the socialist police, the socialist district attorney's office, the socialist prison system, the socialist military, the socialist fire department, the socialist roads, the socialist public schools. There are some complaints. But universal no out-of-pocket health care would be not only showing regard for your fellow human being, it would save you money. A lot of money. And it would free up resources to spend on other things like investing in little children. Now, Professor Heckman, the economist, has shown in a different study that every dollar spent by the government on the welfare of children from when conception becomes known through their first 18 months pays a lifetime compound annual return of 13%. The measure I showed you earlier was about the upfront costs of doing this. This is the total ongoing costs of care. Again, if you can find an investment that'll pay you 7% a year, guaranteed, go put all your money in it. You'll be fine. Your money will double every 10 years. So if you're young and you got 4 or 5 doublings ahead of you, 1,000 becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, becomes 16, becomes 32. You'll be really well off. But we don't do that. We starve these systems. If we really care about our fellow citizens, we should be doing things like universal, no out-of-pocket health care. It shouldn't be a business, it should be a service. We should be driving out of higher education and K through 12 education businesses. Education is not a business. We should be driving out of monopoly supplies, water, sewer, electricity, natural gas, competitive businesses, which, by the way, by law and regulation, make enormous outsized returns on their investment. People who have cooperative nonprofit power or government power, usually municipal, but not always, they pay 15 to 30% less for their electricity than we do here with an electric utility owned by a profit-making company, by the way, that's in Spain, Bilbao, Spain. And we have no idea what their real return is because the state's taken the position that they have no interest in the financial structure by which RG&E was acquired. If it was bought entirely with borrowed money and they refinanced when interest rates for companies were around 4% and they're earning 11%, that means they're making way above the 11% that was authorized because their cost of capital would be only 4%. But we don't know. We don't know what they do. We just know that they're very smart and they're very happy and they really want to hang on to their utility. When we don't have regard for everyone else, including people you can't stand, regard should be for everybody. We end up costing ourselves. We end up damaging ourselves. So the one thing I hope you do is think about how we could, by changing the way we spend money, have better health care, have larger old age income, Social Security. A lot of people make a lot of money. If you're a married couple who've earned the max every year, you're 70 this year and you retire, you can collect about $115,000 from Social Security, the two of you together until you die. On the other hand, if you worked as cleaning houses and got paid under the table, you can end up with a check of literally zero because you don't have any record of payment, or $20 a month, $50 a month. We used to have a minimum Social Security payment, by the way, but during the Reagan years, that was removed by Congress. Think about how fulfilling the message of not just the Bible, but every major religion in the world of having regard for the other could make us better off, could allow us to spend less money on taxes or to spend that money in a way that's more beneficial to the society. So with that, I'll take some questions if people have. Hi there. What's your name?
Elizabeth.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Okay,
You?
good. My question is, back on one of the graphs that you had during the slideshow, you showed, the presidencies and the level of poverty. And there was one very high point, and I'm not sure what president that was under. Was that Bush?
It was slightly after Bush.
After Bush,
So
so.
remember, there are what are called leading economic indicators, things that tell you this is
Right.
going to happen. So for example, if the number of people who are behind on their mortgage payments rises, that's a leading indicator there's trouble coming,
Mhm.
because very few mortgages sour. Lots of credit card debt sours relative to mortgages.
Mm.
And so in the case of the poverty levels, the George W. Bush administration essentially stopped underwriting of mortgages. If you ever got a mortgage and you had to do all that paperwork and prove you really weren't the person with the same name in Montana who's a scalawag and doesn't pay
Oh,
their
yeah.
bills. And it takes a while for things to go through. But as the overheated economy and the level of borrowing, much of it by very sophisticated people who knew exactly what they were doing, came back to haunt the culture. It takes a while for that peak, and then it fell off very rapidly
Yeah.
under Obama.
Mm,
It's
right.
also, however, a factor in why you'll also notice under Obama spending didn't grow. It went down, and because he was trying to reduce the deficit. And when the government goes to an austerity plan, it makes us all worse off, because it's effectively withdrawing money from the economy instead of
spending.
injecting money into the economy.
Right.
So, okay.
Thank you.
Would you please tell us why the term Medicare Advantage is a disadvantage?
Sure.
And why, what it's doing to Medicare itself?
Yeah. So Medicare Advantage is essentially privatizing Medicare. Now, after my wife retired, we were on Medicare Advantage for 2023 and until I went to work at U of R, first 9 months of this year. And on the one hand, if you're a consumer, it's pretty good. They paid part of our bill at the health club, and we had an account to pay for some of the out-of-pocket expenses. But essentially, it drains resources away from Medicare overall, and it's a moneymaker for the insurance companies. The insurance companies are only in this to make money. Let's not miss, anybody who says our business is doing this because we want to improve our community. No, you're doing this because you want to improve your standing in this community, and for no other reason. That profit maximization is the classic economic term, and it's exactly correct. So Medicare Advantage, the government pays more money for it. I think it's 19%. They get the same overhead, but they're getting it on a larger base. And then they market this on the other side to physicians and other providers in ways that encourage them to want to serve people who have Medicare Advantage rather than regular Medicare. The reality is there is no reason to have health insurance. It is a totally superfluous and unnecessary industry. If we had universal health care with no out-of-pocket, first of all, insurance is the idea of risk spreading and risk sharing, right? You pay $1,000 a year in case your house doesn't burn down. And if you own your house for 30 years, you paid $30,000, your house hasn't burned down. Well, you got something. Had it burned down, you would have collected. All right? But healthcare, we all need healthcare. Even the people who never get sick need forms of healthcare. They need to get immunized when they're little for things like measles and other diseases. And so that's a perfect spread. I mean, I used to say to my law students when I was teaching third-year law students at Syracuse, so they're all third years, they're all 24 years old, basically. And I'd say, oh, by the way, I'm curious today. I noticed there were people from the credit card companies on campus yesterday. How many of you got pitched by the people selling kindergarten insurance? Dead silence. Kindergarten insurance, right? There were a lot of kindergarten insurance. Weren't there kindergarten insurance sales? What? I mean, come on, you're in your prime years of your 20s, who as a class are known to engage in behaviors that create a need for kindergarten. weren't they there? So, oh, that's right. The taxpayers provide that at no out-of-pocket charge to you. Well, the same thing should be true of healthcare. We should provide it to ourselves at no out-of-pocket cost to people. You need healthcare, you get it. And by the way, I've had people in audiences say, well, a lot of people just show up to see the doctor. And I'll go, yes, that actually happens. Lonely old people in particular will do that. And doctors I know in both England and France have told me, and Norway, that it's not hard to deal with that. Oh, hi, Mrs. Jones, how are you today? And they sit in your lobby all day and they leave. All you're doing is giving them a chair to sit in the lobby. You know, Mrs. Jones, I got to lock up tonight, but let me walk you down to the bus stop. It's a non-issue. Okay. I mean, have any of you ever gone to the doctor just because you wanted to see the doctor? Please, doctor, stick me with a needle or cut me up with a scalpel or make me take something. No. So there's no reason to have health insurance. Donald Trump had it right when he was a liberal Democrat and a good German. Hi.
Hi.
What's your name?
Sally.
I'm sorry. And I didn't ask your name. I'm sorry. Hi, Gail. Sally, what's up?
When you were talking about what we spend on children and what we spend on seniors, it being in the land of
Now that's federal spending.
right,
So,
right. Being in the land of Frederick Douglass, it made me think of it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. So if you invest in children, you're basically building stronger children and
yes, no, it's
Yeah.
a very wise investment socially as well. When my wife ran the community foundation here, there were two big agendas she came with. She had a theory that a community foundation could do certain things, and about 100 of the 900 community foundations around the country have adopted her idea. I call it civic engagement. That's not what she calls it, but it was the idea that this is the forum to talk about the unexamined and future problems of a society. And so she had this study done, came out in December of 13 and updated every year since, on poverty. And when it came out, it showed that Rochester, statistically, every sixth person in the city lived on less than half the threshold for being poor. The official threshold at the time was low $20,000 for a family of four, which meant we had families living on like $800 a month with a husband, wife, and two kids, or mom and three kids, which is ridiculous. It really changed things around here. The Business Journal, not exactly a publication read by bleeding heart liberals, 94% of the respondents to their survey said that they now believe that extreme poverty was the #1 issue holding back the Rochester economy. And it is. It absolutely is. We have lots of evidence that, by the way, there are more poor people living outside the city than in total numbers. And as a share of the population, you get out in the rural counties, it's extraordinary how much poverty there is. In Penn Yan, where they have a program, Obama gave a presidential medal to the woman who started it to send kids home with food in their backpacks on Friday. They had early on to address kids who would beat up other kids to steal the food because they didn't have any food at home. And it's just remarkable about what's happened to our country. When we were growing up, do you remember seeing homeless people on the streets? I mean, the only homeless people I remember from the 50s were occasionally somebody would come through the farming town we lived in, Orange, California, near Disneyland, who had lost their home or something, and they'd be in their car. But as soon as they got a job, they were back on their feet. And then there would be alcoholics on Skid Row. And that was sort of it. People who became derelicts and people who didn't have any savings and misfortune hit them, and that was temporary. Now we have permanent conditions like this because of the changes we chose to make in our economy when we chose to use the power we have to change policies in 1980 and to throw away the New Deal and adopt a policy of let's get everybody as rich as they want to be or can be. So, yeah, there's not a bad argument to that. Just how you do it. David.
Thank you. You're preaching to the choir.
Yes, I'm trust me, I'm aware. Every chance I get to talk to libertarians, MAGA Republicans, haven't had many of those, but a few, I'm there. I try very hard. And I tailor my address for them to show self-interest.
No, and you know, we are you're trying to change some hearts, and obviously changing institutions is a completely different challenge. And 1980, of course, was when Reagan came in and decided to tell about trickle down economics. I guess my concern is that the trickle down of ethics, which you're trying to impose or suggest, it is really against some pretty ingrained habits in the U.S. Doug Potter, he's another physician here. We had a chief of medicine who was fond of saying that in France, death is an option. In England, death is a duty. But in the United States, death is I'm sorry, in France, it's a tragedy. In England, it's a duty. But in the United States, death is an option.
Yeah.
And we have built an industry about creating expectations.
Well, in line with that, David, we used to have a country where or at least when I grew up in California, the American dream, as I understood it, was you were going to have a successful life. You might prosper, own a home, have a car that starts every morning. It wasn't that you'd have 3 zeros after your 3 commas after your name. That's a billionaire and up. It wasn't about that. And that didn't mean some people weren't going to make a lot of money. Some of them did. That's fine. But we've created this system now where we judge people not on the content of their character, but on the presumed content of their wallets. Mm-hmm. And to make it even worse, here's one of the big things we've done that damages our society. If you had enough resources, which I'm going to define as the annual income from your investments provides twice your annual consumption. So you spend $1 million a year in your lifestyle. If your investments produce over $2 million a year in dividends, just dividends, you can borrow the $1 million a year you need from yourself. And you will avoid paying a minimum in New York state and federal tax rate of 30%, the two combined rates. And your money will continue to grow. At the end of the first year with $1 million, you can charge yourself under a rate set by the IRS 2%. So now you owe $20,000 in interest. You just fold that into your new loan to yourself, and at the end of the next year, you're going to owe $42,000 in interest. You would have paid $300,000 in taxes the first year. So why would you ever pay taxes? And we allow this. We don't have to allow this. Congress can pass a law that says you can't do this. That's why people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk don't pay taxes without cheating. They don't have to pay taxes. You just borrow, but you have to have so much wealth that your wealth is growing significantly faster than your consumption. Tiny segment of people have that kind of money. And so long as the rules say you can do that, the rest of us are worse off. And we see this manifest itself in some ways that I would describe as evil. And one of them is about 25 years ago, the people who ran McDonnell Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach took over Boeing. It was described in the news as a merger, but it was a takeover. That's usually what happens in a merger, is one company is taking over. And the McDonnell Douglas people included an awful lot of financial engineers. And so what do we see just happen at Boeing? We've had these 2 terrible crashes of MAX jets, where it turns out that some of the software coders working on the system that killed people were paid $9 an hour. $9 an hour in India. There are internal documents, a story broken by a newly hired reporter, a young woman on her first week on the job. When the door panel blew out in the Alaska Airlines jet over Portland, this young woman, who'd been trained by investigative reporters and editors, of which I'm a former president, immediately said to herself, there must be a record somewhere, and this probably wasn't an anomaly. There's probably some systemic story here. And she got searching on the internet, and within a day finds out that there's a lawsuit in which a Boeing engineer has included in the lawsuit emails where he's saying, we're not paying attention to safety, we're cutting corners. And a manager writes back, stop whining. Well, Boeing last year, I think it was just last year, it may have been over 2 or 3 years, spent $39 billion buying back stock. There are fewer shares, it makes the share price rise, and executives get primarily paid through dividends, and so do boards of directors of companies. They mostly get shares of stock or options for stock, and $20 billion on dividends. But they just fired 10% of their workforce because they can't afford it. That did not happen prior to the Reagan era. In 1973, we had a recession, a pretty bad one. It was very short-lived, but it was very severe. The head of Delta Airlines announced that he was only going to take $1 a year in his benefits until every pilot was hired back. And that if they had any work at all for pilots who needed it, he said, some pilots are going to be fine. They're going to go to their home in the Caribbean and live well. Senior captains of heavyweight jets back then made roughly $1 million a year if they worked the maximum amount of time allowed. I know this because I had neighbors who were airline pilots in California. This system of profit, and no regard for your workers, the society around you, the safety of your customers, in the long run, as the Chicago School economists will tell you, the market will self-correct, and it will. I don't know how many people will have to die in Boeing plane crashes, or how far down a market would have to collapse, or how many people have to lose their homes, but the market will correct. If we regulate, we can correct a lot earlier. If we criminally punish people who do things, we can correct a lot earlier, because most people, so long as they're charged with a crime that can be paid with a fine, the company can take care of them. But if the penalty is you're going to prison, pal, company can't do anything for you. And that can be a powerful influence on good behavior. So, hi, what's your name?
Grania,
Hi.
hi.
Well,
I,
well,
We're gonna do the last one, if that's all right.
okay, yeah,
Go ahead.
Oh,
We'll be quick.
do we need to stop? Is that it right now?
yeah, so last. question.
Okay, well, that's fine.
Nick.
It should, oh,
Go ahead
okay.
and ask.
I did a lot of work when Obama was running for office, and one of the things that really drew me was his promise of health care reform.
Yeah.
And then very early in his presidency, I mean, I'm going to say like the first couple of weeks, he had a nationwide call to talk about health care reform. And I got on the call because I was very interested.
Well, what's the question?
And the question was, the first group that talked was AHIP, America's Health Insurance Plans. And so was that basically the plan from the beginning, was to
no, I
do
think-
health insurance reform?
Obama did not have a strong congressional majority to back him up. Just
Right.
as if Kamala Harris will win the popular vote by 15 million or more votes, but may not get the presidency because of the Electoral College. But even if she gets the presidency, if the Republicans control the House or the Senate, and the
Right.
Senate looks like that might well happen, she's not going to accomplish anything. And Obama, who was understandably as the first Black president cautious, he was facing this enormous insurance industry that was out to get him quite literally because of his proposals. And so he was extremely cautious and careful about that. It doesn't just matter who gets to the White House. It matters that they have a strong majority. And one of the amazing things about Donald Trump's presidency, and that I've always argued goes to his incompetence. And I wrote about Donald becoming president in 1988.
Wow.
Okay. Was he had majority in the House and the Senate. He didn't do anything because
Right.
he's a fraud. He's a con artist. He doesn't know how to do anything. In Obama's case, he knew how to do things. He's an
Yeah.
incredibly elegant thinker, incredibly smart man, but he didn't have the political muscle behind him to achieve a lot of what he wanted. That the reason we have the Affordable Care Act, which has bent the cost curve in favorably, is not Barack Obama, it's Nancy Pelosi.
Mhm. Right.
Well, thank you.
Thank
And be sure to come next week.
I thought your title was clever. Where do we go from here?
Both assume it in Yeah, until 2010. Okay, who do I give this to?
Sally, you get my message about what I had.
I'm sure life is good.